The survival of any organism depends on one fundamental ability: interpreting signals from the environment before it's too late. Even before the evolution of eyes, ears, or noses, unicellular organisms already had chemical and tactile sensors that allowed them to detect food, light, or danger. What we now call the senses is the result of millions of years of refinement toward a single goal: to transform external stimuli, light, sound, vibration, pressure, odor, heat, into useful data that the brain can decode in real time. The brain itself is trapped inside a dark and silent skull. It never sees, hears, or touches anything directly. All the reality we perceive is a model constructed from the signals captured by our sensory organs. Seeing a tree, hearing a voice, or feeling warmth are not physical events within the brain, but rather electrical and chemical translations of something happening out there. The senses, therefore, are the channels through which the brain gathers data to build this predictive model of the world. This mission is vital because the environment is constantly changing. Noticing a moving shadow, the smell of something burning, or a sudden shift in temperature can mean the difference between life and death. From an evolutionary perspective, organisms that manage to convert this information into quick decisions, run, hide, seek shelter, attack, had a higher chance of survival and reproduction. That explains why the brain devotes such vast areas of the cortex to interpreting sensory data. Nearly half of our brain is directly or indirectly involved in processing stimuli from the senses. Even simple actions like walking or speaking require precise integration between vision, touch, hearing, and proprioception. And when one of these senses fails, the brain must reorganize its structure to compensate for the loss, a phenomenon known as neuroplasticity. Another key point is that the senses do not operate in isolation. They work together in an integrated fashion. That's why we smell while we eat, use gestures when we speak, and can keep our balance even with our eyes closed. This integration happens so automatically that we rarely realize we are using multiple senses at the same time. And it's this very integration that makes our perception so rich and also so vulnerable to errors and illusions. A sound may seem to come from the wrong direction, an image may appear distorted, a taste may change depending on the smell, and a texture may feel softer or rougher based on the expectation created by sight. The brain constantly makes assumptions. It doesn't wait for complete data. It anticipates, interprets, and often fills in reality based on previous experience. The mission of the senses, therefore, goes far beyond merely capturing stimuli. They filter, interpret, and prioritize information. Irrelevant stimuli are ignored, while potential threats or rewards receive maximum attention. This selectivity is regulated by structures like the thalamus and the prefrontal cortex, which act as a sorting center. When we are hungry, the smell of food stands out. When we are afraid, any sound becomes an alert. This sensory priority system is highly adaptable and also prone to failure, as seen in cases of hallucinations, sensory disorders, or sensory overload caused by overstimulating environments like big cities or spaces filled with screens and simultaneous sounds. At the core, the senses are like antennas extended beyond the body. They connect us to the world and, at the same time, protect us from it. They are constant sentinels, sending signals to the brain that say you are safe or you need to act now. And even though they seem like purely biological tools, the senses also shape our culture, our memories, and our emotions. Vision builds images that move us. Music touches us deeply because hearing connects directly with the brain's limbic centers. Smell takes us instantly back to childhood. Touch is essential for affection and recognizing others. And all of this happens while we sleep, walk, think, or cry. The senses never sleep. They are always alert, translating the universe into the inner theater of the mind. If we want to understand how we experience the world, the first step is to accept that the world as we perceive it is a construction. There is no seeing without the brain. There is no hearing without the brain. There is no sensory reality without internal interpretation. The external world is a continuous stream of raw stimuli, and the brain, with its senses, is the invisible sculptor that turns chaos into consciousness. Long before the first eyes, long before the first antennae or touch-sensitive skin, life was already detecting environmental signals to survive. In the early days of biology, when organisms were just simple structures immersed in primitive oceans, the first forms of sensitivity emerged as chemical reactions to external stimuli. Bacterial cells, for example, can move towards sources of food or away from harmful substances. This ability to detect the environment, called chemotaxis, is the direct precursor to all our modern senses. It shows that from the very beginning, nature favored organisms that could feel in order to act, even without brains or nerves. Over hundreds of millions of years, these simple mechanisms became increasingly specialized. Multicellular life required a new form of internal communication: nervous systems. The first primitive neural networks allowed specific stimuli to be perceived in distinct regions of the body and transmitted with increasing speed. This brought an enormous evolutionary advantage: detecting sunlight and moving toward it, sensing the vibration of an approaching predator, detecting chemical changes in the water. Thus the first rudimentary senses emerged, which in different lineages would become eyes, noses, skin, ears, and taste buds. Sensory evolution did not follow a single blueprint, but rather multiple parallel paths that converged into similar solutions across different species. What we call an eye, for instance, independently evolved in at least 40 distinct animal groups, a classic case of convergent evolution. The first eyes were not capable of forming images. They were just light-sensitive patches, cells that could detect the presence or absence of light. Over time, these cells became embedded in concave structures, creating a small shadow and direction effect. Later, with the development of rudimentary lenses and corneas, these eyes began to form blurry images, then sharper ones. This process took hundreds of millions of years and occurred in parallel across mollusks, arthropods, vertebrates, and other groups. The human eye is just one possible version of this long evolutionary journey. Touch developed in a more straightforward way. Any cell capable of sensing pressure or deformation was already a significant advancement. Skin, with its specialized receptors, evolved to differentiate temperatures, pressures, textures, and even pain. Each of these sensations guided by specific, evolutionarily calibrated receptors. Hearing followed a different path. In primitive fish, small structures sensitive to vibration in water gave rise to the vestibular and auditory systems. In terrestrial vertebrates, the tiny bones of the ear evolved from jawbones of ancestral reptiles, creating a sophisticated system for transmitting airborne sound. Human hearing, therefore, carries the mark of multiple adaptations, from water to air, from vibration to sound frequency. Smell and taste, in contrast, have more chemical roots. Both rely on receptors capable of identifying specific molecules. Smell originated as a system for detecting airborne particles, essential for locating food, mating partners, or predators. Taste evolved to protect the interior of the body, discerning flavors based on risk or benefit. Sweet signals energy, bitterness warns of toxins, sour indicates spoiled food, and salty helps regulate minerals. Curiously, throughout evolution, many senses have emerged, disappeared, or radically changed function. Humans lost the highly acute sense of smell their ancestors once had, but developed far more refined color vision. Some species of deep-sea fish have lost their eyes entirely, as total darkness rendered vision useless. Bats developed echolocation, an active type of hearing that lets them see their surroundings through sound. Snakes detect heat with infrared sensors on their faces. Sharks can sense the electric fields of prey hidden beneath the sand. Evolution doesn't just create new senses, it adapts, removes, and rebuilds them. And this dynamic is dictated by the environment. The sense that offers an advantage is the one that survives. Finally, it's important to remember that senses do not evolve in isolation. They evolve alongside the brain that interprets them. A sophisticated eye would be useless without a brain capable of processing images. Skin full of receptors wouldn't make sense without a nervous system able to distinguish a soft touch from painful pressure. Thus, the brain and senses grew together in a continuous evolutionary dance. Modern neuroscience sees the senses as extensions of the nervous system. They are not separate organs, but part of a living, dynamic circuit where stimulus and interpretation are inseparable. To sense is to interpret, and evolution has shown us that interpreting well is the key to life. Seeing is not just opening your eyes. Seeing is interpreting light. Human vision is the result of a highly sophisticated process that begins in the retina and ends in the visual cortex, but it relies on a chain of chemical, electrical, and perceptual transformations for a single photon wave to become, for the brain, a comprehensible image. It all starts when light, reflected by the objects around us, passes through the lenses of our eyes and hits the retina, a layer of photosensitive tissue lining the inside of the eyeball. This retina functions as a biological sensor, filled with cells called cones and rods, which convert light into electrical impulses. Rods detect variations in brightness and are essential for night vision. Cones, on the other hand, are responsible for color perception and are concentrated at the center of the retina, especially in the fovea, a small region where visual acuity is at its peak. The retina itself already performs an important part of visual processing. It is not a passive screen. It extracts edges, contrasts, and initial motion. These data are then sent through the optic nerve to the brain, where a surprise occurs. The image sent by the retina is inverted and blurry. The brain must reinterpret, rotate, correct, compare with past memories, and finally create what we call visual perception. That's why seeing is not a direct process. The light that enters the eyes is just the first step. The image we see is a mental construction based not only on current visual data, but also on expectations, past experiences, and active corrections performed by the brain. The primary visual cortex, located at the back of the brain, is where these signals are organized into shapes, directions, and colors. But true understanding of what is seen happens in even more complex regions like the temporal cortex and parietal lobe, which assign meaning to what is being observed. Vision is also selective. We do not see everything in front of us. The brain constantly filters information. We may be looking at a room full of objects and only notice what we consider relevant. This process, known as visual attention, is closely tied to consciousness and memory. Often the brain automatically fills in gaps. A simple example is the blind spot, an area of the retina with no photoreceptors because it's where the optic nerve exits the eye. And yet we don't perceive a hole in our visual field. The brain fills that space based on surrounding information. That's also why we can read words with missing letters, recognize faces with incomplete features, or imagine shapes where there are none, like in clouds. There is also a fascinating phenomenon. The human eye is constantly moving, even when we think we are staring at something. These microscopic movements, called microsaccades, prevent the image from shutting off when it remains static on the retina, as our photoreceptors quickly adapt to constant light. This dynamic correction system is so efficient that most people don't even realize the world is being refreshed multiple times per second. Another detail is that vision is not symmetrical between the two eyes. Each eye sees a slightly different angle, and the brain combines these two images to generate depth. This binocular vision allows us to perceive the world's contours, calculate distances, and move accurately, an evolutionary advantage crucial for hunters, navigators, and drivers. In extreme cases, such as cortical blindness, the eyes continue to function perfectly, but the brain is unable to interpret visual signals. Patients with this condition may see physiologically, but are unable to recognize faces, objects, or movement. One of the most notable examples is prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize faces, even when the person can still recognize objects. This shows that vision is not just capturing light, but understanding what is being seen. A face, for instance, requires activation of specific brain areas like the fusiform gyrus. When this area is damaged, the brain no longer knows who is in front of it, even when seeing the physical features clearly. Other people may experience illusions of movement in static images, like in certain optical illusions, that trick the brain through repetitive patterns. Vision science has also revealed a curious paradox. Our eyes capture only a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. We see between 380 and 750 nanometers, the so-called visible spectrum. Beyond that are radio waves, microwaves, infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays, all invisible to us, but detectable by other animals or instruments. Bees see ultraviolet, snakes detect heat, bats use sound. Humans, despite all their complexity, still have a limited and highly interpretative form of vision. That's why everything we see is just one possible version of the world, a useful simulation, but far from objective reality. To see is to trust in the most extraordinary machine nature has created, a pair of eyes connected to a brain that insists on turning light into meaning, form into emotion. image into thought. Human vision is both a survival tool and a source of beauty. Without it, there would be no art, cinema, reading, or social recognition. But even with it, we still live in an interpreted world, not a directly perceived one. Most people believe that seeing depends only on the eyes, but neuroscience has already shown that true vision happens in the brain. That's why a person can have perfectly healthy eyes and still be functionally blind. This is the case with cortical blindness, a condition in which the damage is not in the eyeballs or optic nerves, but in the brain regions responsible for processing visual signals, especially the occipital cortex. Patients with cortical blindness live in a world without conscious images, yet in some cases they can respond to visual stimuli without realizing they are seeing them, a phenomenon known as blind sight. It's as if the brain still captures light and shapes, but without generating conscious perception. This demonstrates clearly and powerfully that seeing is not the same as perceiving. To see is to interpret. This gap between what the eyes capture and what the brain understands is the foundation of optical illusions, phenomena in which the mind is tricked by patterns of light, color, shape, or motion. Illusions reveal the flaws and shortcuts of the visual system. Our brain doesn't patiently wait for complete data. It anticipates, fills gaps, and makes decisions based on past experiences. This saves time and energy, but also makes us vulnerable to mistakes. Simple illusions, like parallel lines that appear tilted or static circles that seem to spin, are enough to show how the brain can be misled by context, shadows, contrasts, or repetition. More complex illusions involve faces changing expression, depending on the angle, or objects that seem to change size, depending on the background. All of these experiences show that vision is not passive. It is an active construction of the brain. There are also so-called cognitive illusions, where the error doesn't lie in the eyes, but in how the brain processes meaning. A famous example is the illusion of faces in objects, known as pareidolia. We see faces in electrical outlets, clouds, mountains, cakes. This happens because the human brain has specialized circuits for face recognition, and it prefers to make false positives rather than false negatives. Seeing a face where there is none is evolutionarily safer than failing to recognize a real one. The same applies to motion illusions, like when we see a blinking face in a static advertisement, or perceive depth in flat images. In all these cases, the brain is trying to make sense of what it receives, and in doing so, it reveals its own internal mechanisms, its assumptions, filters, and blind spots. Illusions can also be used therapeutically or artistically. In clinical settings, they help diagnose neurological disorders, assess the integrity of the visual cortex, or rehabilitate patients with perceptual deficits. In art, they create unique sensory experiences, such as in the works of painter M.C. Escher, where staircases go up and down simultaneously, or in anamorphoses, where images only make sense from certain angles. In virtual environments, illusions are used to create augmented reality, immersive experiences, and multisensory stimuli. The very concept of virtual reality is based on generating a coherent and believable illusion for the brain, even if the stimuli don't come from the physical world. In other words, if the brain believes it, the body reacts. This leads us to the conclusion that the brain on some level treats real and simulated stimuli the same way. Extreme cases also illustrate how vision is shaped by the brain. People born blind who regain vision later in life after surgery cannot see immediately. Their eyes work, but their brains have never learned to interpret visual stimuli. These individuals often require years of training to distinguish shapes, faces, and distances. They show that vision is not innate, it is learned. On the other hand, individuals who lose vision due to cortical injury report phenomena like flashes of light, moving shadows, or sensations of seeing, even in the dark. There are also reports of inattentional blindness, when a person fails to see something obvious because they are focused on something else. This happens because the brain prioritizes attention over raw visual input. We can look directly at something and still not see it if it isn't on our mental priority list. This universe of illusions, selective blindness, and phantom perceptions makes it clear that seeing is more subjective than we think. What we call visual reality is a dynamic mosaic built by millions of neurons, operating in fractions of a second. When we look at something, we're seeing both what is there and what we expect to find. The image we have of the world is a projection. And this leads to a fascinating question. To what extent can we trust what we see? Science responds with humility. We see enough to survive, but not enough to understand everything. The world we see is just one possible and often illusory version of what truly exists. Sound is an invisible vibration that travels through the air as pressure waves. Our ear is the biological machine responsible for translating those vibrations into electrical signals that the brain can understand. Although it may seem simple, hearing a voice, music, or thunder, the auditory process involves one of the most ingenious structures of the human body, the ear. Divided into 3 regions, outer, middle, and inner, it acts as a bridge between the physical world and the neural universe. Sound, as it enters through the pinna, is channeled toward the eardrum, a sensitive membrane that vibrates according to the frequency of sound waves. These vibrations are transmitted to the smallest bones in the human body, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. Measuring about 2 to 4 millimeters, these ossicles amplify the vibrations and transfer them to the cochlea, located in the inner ear. The cochlea is a spiral-shaped structure filled with fluid and lined with thousands of hair cells. These cells are the true auditory receptors. When the fluid in the cochlea moves, the hairs on these cells bend and trigger electrical signals through the auditory nerve to the brain. Remarkably, different regions of the cochlea are sensitive to different frequencies, high-pitched sounds at the base, low-pitched at the apex, allowing the brain to identify tones with extraordinary precision. This system is so refined that we can distinguish individual voices in a crowd, detect musical tones, and determine the direction of a sound based on minute differences in time and intensity between our ears. It is a natural engineering feat so precise that it directly inspired microphones, speakers, and headphones used today. Sound is also essential for balance, as the inner ear houses not only the cochlea, but also the vestibular labyrinth, a system of semicircular canals filled with fluid that detect head movement and body position. That's why auditory disorders often cause dizziness, nausea, or imbalance. At the cortical level, auditory signals are processed in the primary auditory cortex, located in the temporal lobe. But recognizing voices, music, or linguistic patterns involves even more specialized areas, such as the secondary auditory cortex and the Wernicke and Broca regions, responsible for language comprehension and production. This processing is so fast and automatic that we can follow conversations even in noisy environments, identify accents, detect emotion in tone, and even predict the next word based on context. Unlike vision, hearing cannot be turned off voluntarily. Even while we sleep, our ears remain active. This explains why certain sounds wake us quickly, while others blend into dreams. It also explains why babies recognize their mother's voice right after birth. They were already hearing it in the womb. Sound holds deep emotional power. It directly activates structures like the amygdala and hippocampus, which are responsible for emotion and memory. That's why music can make us cry, bring back specific childhood memories, or cause chills. The human brain seems to have been shaped by music, or at least by the ability to perceive rhythmic and melodic patterns. Some studies suggest that music may have evolved alongside language as an ancestral form of emotional communication. Interestingly, the brain can also invent sound. People with tinnitus hear non-existent noises, usually caused by damage to the cochlea's hair cells. The brain attempts to compensate for the lack of input and ends up generating internal sounds, an example of plasticity that, in this case, results in discomfort. There are also cases of auditory hallucinations, common in certain psychiatric disorders, where voices or sounds are perceived without any real stimulus. This shows that sound, like vision, is a cerebral construction subject to error, distortion, and interference. There's even the phenomenon of hearing words in random noises, like when a reversed audio clip seems to reveal a hidden phrase, which highlights the brain's tendency to seek patterns, even where none exist. Hearing is also a sense with strong social implications. The ability to listen accurately enables the development of language, music, education, and social interaction. People with hearing impairments develop alternative strategies, such as lip reading or sign language, but face daily barriers imposed by a society designed for those who hear. On the other hand, many deaf individuals develop heightened sensitivity to vibrations, visual cues, and tactile patterns. Technology has also advanced toward restoring hearing through cochlear implants, which partially replace the cochlear's functions and allow sound to be converted directly into electrical stimuli for the auditory nerve. This represents a meeting point between biology and engineering, where science literally reconstructs perception. Hearing is more than detecting sound. It is understanding language, recognizing danger, diving into music, being moved by words. Sound connects us to others, to our surroundings, and to ourselves. And even though we cannot see it, we are shaped by sound from the womb to old age. Hearing is invisible, but essential. And the human ear, with its delicate labyrinth and constant dialogue with the brain, is one of the most extraordinary windows we have to the world. The human brain doesn't just decode external sounds, it also creates them, distorts them, and interprets them in unexpected ways. That's why we sometimes hear things that aren't there, perceive speech in random noise, or get the impression that a sound is moving even if it's coming from a fixed point. These phenomena, known as auditory illusions, reveal the complexity of hearing as a brain-based experience, not just a sensory one. One of the most famous illusions is the shepherd tone, in which a sequence of tones gives the impression of rising infinitely, an acoustic trick similar to a sonic Penrose staircase. Another example is the McGurk effect, which shows how vision interferes with hearing. When we see someone saying one syllable but hear another, the brain creates a third sound that doesn't match either the real audio or the visual cue. This demonstrates that hearing is often a multimodal experience. There are also spatial illusions, like the Haas effect, which makes us perceive that a sound comes from a specific direction based on micro differences in timing between the two ears. This allows us to locate the origin of sounds with millimetric precision, a crucial evolutionary ability for detecting predators or finding water sources. In modern environments, however, this system can be deceived by reverberations or artificial sounds. For example, when we use headphones with binaural audio, we feel that the sound surrounds us in 3 dimensions, even with our eyes closed. This occurs because the brain interprets the differences in phase and intensity between both ears as a spatial map. Audio engineering takes advantage of this phenomenon to create immersive experiences, especially in games, movies, and virtual reality simulations. But not all unusual auditory perceptions are harmless. Many people live with a persistent condition called tinnitus, characterized by the continuous perception of sounds, like hissing, ringing, or engine noise, even in the absence of any external stimulus. It's estimated that more than 10% of the global population suffers from this symptom, which can range from mildly annoying to severely debilitating. Tinnitus usually appears after exposure to loud noises, aging, or inner ear damage, especially to the hair cells in the cochlea. When those cells are damaged or die, the brain tries to compensate for the lack of auditory input by amplifying background neural noise, and this internal echo becomes a persistent sound. It's not a hallucination in the classic sense, but rather an artifact of brain plasticity, attempting to fill in sensory gaps. Another curious phenomenon is that of phantom voices, or auditory verbal hallucinations. While often associated with psychiatric conditions such as schizophrenia, these experiences can also occur in people with no diagnosed disorder, especially during sensory deprivation, extreme stress, grief, or insomnia. Some people report hearing their names being called, whispers as they fall asleep, or full phrases from nowhere. Neuroscience approaches these occurrences with caution, as they reveal how the brain can generate language and sound even without external stimuli. Brain regions such as the superior temporal gyrus may become internally activated, producing the sensation of hearing something. In some cases, the brain attributes these voices to external sources, while in others, the individual recognizes them as internally generated. Auditory illusions are also part of art and culture. In music, composers use dissonances, overlapping notes, and echo effects to evoke unusual sensations. Surround sound in cinema creates realistic audio environments that trick the brain. In religious ceremonies or deep meditations, certain sounds, such as chants, drums, or mantras, can induce altered states of consciousness, demonstrating the emotional and psychic power of hearing. In industrial environments, certain continuous frequencies can cause physical discomfort, restlessness, or even mild hallucinations, a field still under exploration by acoustics and neuroscience researchers. What's most fascinating is that the brain needs sound to organize itself. Children born deaf and not exposed to auditory stimuli in their early years show significant alterations in cortical areas related to language and temporal perception. This shows that sound isn't just for hearing. It structures the mind, internal rhythm, and our sense of time. When sound is absent or dysfunctional, the brain tries to compensate creatively, and often imperfectly. That's why absolute silence can be uncomfortable for some, while others hear non-existent sounds as an attempt to keep the brain stimulated. Hearing, therefore, is both a gateway to the world and a mirror of the mind. And when sound behaves unusually, whether through illusion, compensation, or overload, it reveals a faithful portrait of brain function. What we hear isn't just vibration, it's interpretation, expectation, memory, and in some cases, pure internal creation. Sound can heal, disturb, guide, or deceive, but in all cases, it shows that the brain is an invisible conductor, capable of orchestrating real and imagined symphonies within a universe where silence is rarely absolute. Before eyes captured light or ears perceived sound, the first living beings were already sensing the world through smell. Olfaction is the oldest of the senses, with roots tracing back to unicellular organisms that detected chemical substances in their surroundings to survive. In humans, this ancient system remains present and powerful, though often underestimated. The process begins when volatile particles from chemical substances float through the air and enter the nostrils. As they pass through the nasal cavity, these molecules reach the olfactory epithelium, where millions of specialized receptors are located, each one sensitive to a specific type of odor. These receptors are part of the olfactory neurons, which transmit signals directly to the olfactory bulb, a brain structure situated just above the nasal cavity. What's most surprising is that, unlike other senses, smell has a direct connection to the brain's oldest regions, especially the limbic system, which includes the amygdala and hippocampus, centers responsible for emotions and memories. This explains why smells have such immediate and powerful effects on our recollections. A simple aroma of baking cake can transport us back to childhood. The scent of a forgotten perfume can resurrect loves, traumas, places, and sensations. These associations are so intense that they often occur without rational mediation. It's as if smell has an emotional shortcut in the brain, a direct channel to the unconscious, and that's why olfactory memories are more vivid and enduring than visual or auditory ones. The brain stores smells as emotional markers, creating sensory maps of the past. From an evolutionary perspective, smell was essential for survival. Animals use it to locate food, identify territories, recognize kin, and detect predators. Modern humans, although less dependent on smell for hunting or escaping, still respond to it intensely. Tests show we can detect over 1 trillion different odors, even though we rarely name them accurately. This ability is amplified by mechanisms like olfactory adaptation, which causes us to ignore constant smells after a few minutes, and combinatorial coding, in which multiple receptors activate simultaneously to generate a scent profile. A perfume, for instance, isn't a single substance but a blend of molecules acting in harmony to produce a complex and rich perception. Smell is also a sense that ages over time. After the age of 60, many people begin to lose some olfactory capacity, a phenomenon called hyposmia. In more severe cases, anosmia, total loss of smell, can occur, often linked to viral infections, head trauma, or neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. In many of these conditions, loss of smell appears years before other symptoms, functioning as an early warning sign. This reveals the neurological depth of the olfactory system. It is not just an extension of the nose, but a subtle marker of brain health. Recently, smell gained prominence during the COVID-19 pandemic, as many patients reported sudden loss of the sense, reinforcing how essential it is and how its absence affects quality of life. There is also a social and behavioral dimension to smell. Studies show that scent strongly influences interpersonal attraction. Humans emit pheromones, chemical substances that, although not consciously smelled, modulate emotional and sexual responses. Women, for example, perceive male scent differently depending on their menstrual cycle. People in love can recognize their partner's scent among dozens. Even newborns identify their mothers by smell just days after birth. In cultures around the world, smells are used symbolically, aesthetically, and medicinally. Incense in religious rituals, essential oils in aromatherapy, and perfumes as a form of body language show that smell transcends biology. It is also symbolic. Even more fascinating is olfactory synesthesia, a rare condition in which some people associate smells with colors, shapes, or words. A scent might evoke the number 7. A perfume might appear as the color purple. This shows how the senses can cross, merge, and expand the boundaries of perception. There are also clinical cases where non-existent odors are perceived, called phantosmia, usually related to epileptic seizures, tumors, or medication side effects. These episodes confirm that smell, although dependent on external molecules, can also be triggered by purely cerebral stimuli. Smell, therefore, can exist without a source. It can be memory, hallucination, or emotion. In the end, smell reminds us that the invisible is also felt. It connects us to the world in an intimate and instinctive way. We don't see smells, we don't touch them, but they deeply shape how we live, relate, and remember. The nose, with its microscopic apparatus and direct connection to the emotional heart of the brain, is far more than an air filter. It is a sensory oracle, a guardian of memory, a chemical whisper from the world into the soul. The absence of something that has always been present reveals its importance in a brutal way. When we lose our sense of smell, even temporarily, the world becomes dull, flat, as if it had lost one of its dimensions. This phenomenon is called anosmia, and although it may seem minor compared to blindness or deafness, its emotional and social consequences are profound. Food loses its flavor, environments become indistinct, and the body stops receiving subtle signals of danger, pleasure, or comfort. People with anosmia report depression, isolation, and a sense of disconnection from the world. This happens because smell is not just a sense, it's an emotional navigation system, and its loss breaks this silent bond with the environment. Science now recognizes that the loss of smell can be an early marker of serious diseases, such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and also a neurological post-viral symptom, as seen on a large scale during the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's not just absence that intrigues us. The world of invisible smells is vast, mysterious, and full of implications. One of the most fascinating aspects is that of pheromones, chemical substances produced by one organism that trigger behavioral responses in another of the same species. In insects, the effect of pheromones is well documented. Ants follow chemical trails, moths detect mates from miles away, bees organize hives based on scent signals. In mammals, pheromones also play important roles, influencing sexual behavior, territoriality, and social recognition. But what about humans? Although the vomeronasal system, a specialized organ for detecting pheromones, is active in many animals, its function in humans is controversial. Still, there is evidence that subtle smells affect our mood, attraction, and even unconscious decisions. Experiments have shown, for example, that women prefer the scent of men whose immune systems differ genetically from their own, a biological mechanism to enhance the genetic diversity of offspring. Other studies indicate that babies recognize their mothers by smell even before developing vision. Even body sweat carries signals about emotional states. It's possible to distinguish the scent of fear, anger, or happiness. And all of this happens below the level of awareness. Our brain interprets and responds to these chemical messages without us realizing that anything was perceived. This makes smell a silent, primitive language that shapes our actions without the need for reason. It's as if we're connected by invisible trails of meaning. Olfactory technology is just beginning to explore this universe. New devices are attempting to capture, synthesize, and transmit smells digitally, which could lead to a revolution in virtual environments. Imagine smelling a forest during a documentary, or the aroma of a dish during a cooking tutorial. Advertising already uses scent marketing in stores, hotels, and even cars, associating specific aromas with sensations of luxury, cleanliness, or desire. But there are also risks. The unconscious manipulation of behavior through smell raises ethical questions. After all, if something invisible can influence decisions without our knowledge, to what extent are we truly in control? Beyond pheromones, there are other smells we don't consciously perceive that still affect our health. Volatile organic compounds released by furniture, paints and cleaning products, often imperceptible to the conscious nose, can trigger allergies, headaches, and even chronic illnesses. Olfactory pollution also affects quality of life. In large cities, the mixture of artificial odors, smoke and sewage creates a sensorily toxic environment that overloads the nervous system. In contrast, nature's scents are subtler, more organized and informative. The smell of wet earth, for instance, is caused by a substance called geosmin, produced by soil bacteria. This odor is detected by humans at extremely low concentrations, even parts per trillion, and is instinctively associated with rain and fertility. What's most surprising is that smells can also be learned and conditioned. An initially neutral odor can become repulsive or pleasant, depending on the experience associated with it. This happens because the olfactory bulb is directly connected to the hippocampus, the memory center. A trauma can turn the smell of perfume into an emotional trigger. A loving memory can immortalize the scent of a place. This olfactory plasticity shows that scent is not in the air, it's in the brain. It is an interpretation loaded with affection, context, and time. That's why an aroma can make us cry without knowing why. In the end, smell reminds us that there is much more in the world than what we see or hear. It connects us to the invisible, to memory, instinct, and others. And even when the nose fails, the brain keeps searching for those chemical traces, trying to decipher the world that breathes around us. Smell, though often ignored, is one of the deepest forms of feeling, and perhaps the quietest. The act of eating may seem simple, bite, chew, swallow, but behind this everyday gesture lies one of the most complex and fascinating sensory experiences of the human body: taste. Much more than simply detecting flavors, taste is a refined biochemical system connected to smell, touch, temperature, hearing, and even vision. That's why eating is a multisensory experience. A well-presented dish seems more flavorful. The sound of crunchiness activates expectations, and mouthfeel can turn an ordinary meal into something memorable. At the center of this experience is the tongue, a muscular organ that, besides articulating speech, is covered with thousands of sensory structures called taste buds. These contain specialized cells that identify 5 basic tastes: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. These tastes are not distributed in separate zones on the tongue, as was once believed, but rather spread across the entire oral surface, including the throat and inner cheeks. Each taste has a clear evolutionary function. Sweet signals the presence of carbohydrates, a quick energy source. Salty indicates essential minerals such as sodium. Sour warns of potentially spoiled or fermented foods. Bitter serves as a defense system against toxins, which is why many poisonous substances are bitter. Umami, discovered in the early 20th century, signals the presence of amino acids like glutamate, found in meats, broths, and aged cheeses, and is strongly associated with feelings of satisfaction and satiety. When we eat, chemical compounds in food dissolve in saliva and come into contact with taste receptors. These receptors send signals to the brain via cranial nerves, primarily the facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves. This information converges in brain areas such as the nucleus of the solitary tract, the thalamus, and the gustatory cortex, where it is integrated with data from smell and touch. This explains why loss of smell drastically affects flavor perception, a common phenomenon during colds, sinus infections, or viral illnesses like COVID-19. Without smell, food seems tasteless, because much of what we call flavor is actually a combination of aroma and taste. Taste alone is limited, but combined with the other senses, it becomes a symphony. Another essential factor in the taste experience is temperature. Very hot or cold foods activate thermal and tactile receptors that modulate flavor perception. An overly cold ice cream may seem less sweet than it is, while a hot coffee enhances bitterness. Texture, in turn, is perceived by pressure and vibration receptors in the mouth and strongly influences our food preferences. The crunchiness of a cookie, the creaminess of mashed potatoes, the viscosity of a sauce, all contribute to what the brain interprets as pleasant or not. The sounds of chewing activate brain areas linked to expectation and reward, which explains why food ASMR videos have a relaxing and even pleasurable effect for some people. Interestingly, taste is not fixed. It changes throughout life. Young children are more sensitive to bitterness and tend to prefer sweets, an evolutionary protection against toxic plants and a search for quick energy during growth. Over time, taste adapts, shaped by culture, repetition, and emotional context. People who spend their lives rejecting a certain food may learn to enjoy it through gradual exposure and positive associations. This shows that taste is, in part, trainable. And since it involves the limbic system, the emotional center, it can also be conditioned. A food linked to a bad memory can become repulsive. A simple meal shared during a meaningful moment can become an indelible emotional memory. Beyond the individual experience, taste has deep cultural roots. Flavors are social constructs. What is considered delicious or disgusting varies radically between cultures. Fermented, spicy, bitter, overly sweet, all depend on the sensory repertoire of each community. The science of taste, called gustation, now intersects with fields like molecular gastronomy, neurogastronomy, and behavioral nutrition. Recent discoveries show that even gut bacteria can influence our food preferences by altering the release of neurotransmitters and hormones related to appetite. This opens the door to a deeper understanding of what makes us crave certain flavors and avoid others. Finally, there are rare conditions that reveal the complexity of taste. People with ageusia cannot taste at all. Others with dysgeusia experience distorted or metallic flavors, often caused by medications, vitamin deficiencies, or nerve damage. There is also gustatory synesthesia, where sounds or words trigger taste sensations, like someone who tastes iron when hearing a specific musical note. These cases reinforce a fundamental truth. Taste is in the brain, not the mouth. It is a sensory, emotional, and cultural construction that transforms chemistry into experience, molecules into pleasure, nutrition into memory. Eating, therefore, is not just a physiological act. It is a silent conversation between molecules and neurons. It is the brain savoring the world with curiosity, sensitivity, and emotion. Human taste is not limited to identifying 5 basic flavors. It interprets them within biological, emotional, and cultural contexts that transform each bite into a multifaceted experience. Among these flavors, sweet and umami play singular roles, as they are directly associated with reward, pleasure, and survival. Sweetness indicates the presence of sugars, a fundamental energy source for cellular metabolism. That's why from birth, humans demonstrate an innate preference for sweet substances, a response that originates in the brain, not in culture. Breast milk, for example, is naturally sweet, reinforcing the link between sweetness and safety. Activation of sweet receptors on the tongue stimulates dopamine release in the brain, reinforcing a sense of well-being and creating an emotional memory of that flavor. Umami, a Japanese term meaning delicious taste, was identified in the early 20th century by scientist Kikunai Ikeda while studying the distinctive flavor of seaweed broth. It is triggered by the presence of monosodium glutamate and other essential amino acids that signal protein, the fundamental building blocks of cells. Foods rich in umami, such as meats, mushrooms, roasted tomatoes, and aged cheeses, activate specific receptors on the tongue that send signals of dense nutrition to the brain. This activation not only produces satisfaction, but also prolonged satiety, which explains why umami-rich meals feel more complete. Studies show that umami played an evolutionary role in the selection of biologically valuable foods, especially in times of scarcity. It also enhances other flavors, functioning as a sensory amplifier. On the other hand, the taste of fear is more symbolic than sensory, but it has a real basis in human physiology. When we experience fear or intense stress, the body enters a state of alert, releasing adrenaline, cortisol, and other substances that alter the function of taste receptors. Taste can become more sensitive, muted, or even distorted. People in panic report metallic flavors, sudden bitterness, or complete loss of taste. This occurs because the body prioritizes the survival response, fight or flight, and deactivates energy-consuming functions such as digestion and appetite. Chronic anxiety can also have indirect effects, altering the gut microbiota, affecting salivation, and even changing food preferences. This demonstrates that taste is not fixed. It adapts to emotional state, environment, and current need. There are also genetic variations that make some people more sensitive to certain flavors. A classic example is the compound PTC, which tastes intensely bitter to some and completely tasteless to others. This reveals that taste is not universal. It is modulated by genes, hormones, age, and experience. Pregnant women, for instance, often report dramatic changes in taste, with aversions to previously pleasant flavors and sudden cravings for unusual foods. This may be linked to fetal protection, which requires a safe and predictable biochemical environment. Elderly people tend to lose taste sensitivity, which can lead to excessive consumption of salt or sugar to compensate for diminished intensity. This phenomenon has major public health implications, as these changes may contribute to hypertension, diabetes, and malnutrition. The brain can also be tricked by what it sees. The color of food significantly alters flavor perception. A blue lemon juice may seem sweeter or more sour depending on visual expectation. Likewise, texture, crunchy, creamy, liquid, influences taste judgment. In controlled experiments, the same substance is perceived as more or less pleasant depending on background sound, lighting, or the material of the container. This shows that taste is in fact a multisensory construction. Some companies now specialize in designing dining experiences that manipulate sound, light, temperature, and narrative to transform a simple meal into something unforgettable, all based on the neuroscience of flavor. Another curious aspect is unconscious gustatory memory. Our brains store preferences starting in the womb. What the mother consumes during pregnancy influences the baby's food preferences after birth. These memories are formed not through words, but through biochemical associations between taste and emotional state. This is why childhood foods have an almost magical power of comfort and nostalgia. These emotional memories can be positive or negative. A food associated with a traumatic moment may provoke lasting aversion, even if the taste itself isn't bad. This shows that taste is not just a physical reaction, it is an emotional event imprinted in the body. From instinctive sweetness to ancestral umami, including flavors that fear erases or distorts, human taste is an adaptable, sensitive system deeply connected to our biography. It reveals who we are, where we live, what we've learned, and even what we fear. When we eat, we don't just nourish the body. We reactivate a living archive of sensations, memories, and emotions that silently shape us with every bite. Touch is the first sense to develop in the embryo and the last to leave us at death. It accompanies us before we open our eyes or hear our first sound. It is present from the top of the head to the soles of the feet, distributed across the skin, the largest organ in the human body. More than just a protective barrier, the skin is a vast sensory network, a tactile map of the world that transforms pressure, texture, heat, cold, and pain into electrical impulses interpreted by the brain. Every square centimeter of skin contains thousands of specialized sensory receptors: Meissner corpuscles for light touch and vibration, Pacinian corpuscles for deep pressure, thermoreceptors for detecting temperature variations, and nociceptors for identifying painful stimuli. These sensors don't merely record information, they classify, compare, and prioritize sensations even before reaching consciousness. At the slightest contact, the breeze brushing the face, a tight hug, the warmth of a cup, the body activates a chain of electrical signals that travel through peripheral nerves, enter the spinal cord, and ascend to the brain. There, the somatosensory cortex organizes these sensations into a true body map, known as the sensory homunculus. Body parts with more nerve endings, such as the lips, hands, and fingers, occupy disproportionately larger areas in the brain. This explains why we can feel fine details with our fingertips, identify textures with our lips, and precisely distinguish touches in different regions of the skin. Tactile distribution is not democratic. It reflects the functional and emotional importance of each body part. Feet feel to keep us upright. Hands feel to explore the world. The mouth feels to protect what enters the body. Touch is also the only sense that operates bidirectionally. It not only informs us about the world, but also expresses emotion. A caress conveys affection. A handshake communicates intentions. A kiss, a hug, a pat on the shoulder, all are social codes tools of nonverbal language deeply rooted in biology and culture. Studies show that human touch releases oxytocin, the so-called love hormone, while reducing stress, lowering blood pressure, and improving immunity. Babies deprived of touch show developmental delays. Elderly people who receive massages or affectionate touch sleep better, feel less lonely, and report greater well-being. Touch is, therefore, an emotional channel, connecting bodies and minds in a silent language of presence and care. From an evolutionary standpoint, touch has always been essential for survival. It allows us to detect the heat of fire, the chill of water, the roughness of a dangerous surface. It alerts us to cuts, stings, burns, and infections before the damage worsens. But touch is also highly adaptable. People who lose their vision, for example, develop enhanced tactile sensitivity. Braille readers train their brains to transform small bumps into words and meanings. This happens because the somatosensory cortex is plastic. It reorganizes itself based on use and necessity. A violinist will have larger areas devoted to the fingers of the left hand, for instance. Amputees may feel a phantom limb, proof that the tactile map persists in the brain even when the physical body is no longer present. Touch can also be deceived. Experiments with tactile illusions show that the brain can be tricked into believing an artificial object is part of the body, as in the famous rubber hand experiment, where simultaneous stimulation of a fake and real hand generates the sensation of ownership over the fake one. This suggests that touch is fundamental to our bodily self-image. If the brain feels something as its own, it recognizes it as part of the self. On the other hand, certain neurological disorders cause tactile depersonalization, in which individuals don't recognize parts of their own body or feel non-existent touches, a devastating phenomenon for identity and psychological integrity. Beyond conscious touch, there is passive and continuous tactile input, such as the feel of clothing on the skin, the contact of the ground while walking, or the mattress that supports the body during sleep. The brain constantly filters this information to avoid sensory overload. This allows us to focus on relevant stimuli, like the touch of a mosquito or the tip of a sharp object. This balance between sensitivity and filtering is maintained by complex regulatory systems involving the thalamus and attention control structures. But in clinical conditions like fibromyalgia, this filter fails, and the brain interprets neutral stimuli as pain, creating a cycle of persistent suffering with no apparent cause. Touch, with its silent network of sensors spread across the body, is the only sense that never stops. We can't close the skin like we close our eyes or ears. We are constantly feeling the ground beneath our feet, the air around us, the pressure of our own body. This sense anchors us in the physical world, protects us and connects us, and although it often goes unnoticed, it is the foundation of our perception of reality and our capacity to love, care, and recognize ourselves. Pain is not located in the skin, the bones, or the muscles. It is born in the brain. Although we may feel it in an injured finger, an open wound, or an inflamed joint, what we call pain is a cerebral interpretation of a threat signal. This signal begins with nociception, the process by which specialized nerve endings detect potentially harmful stimuli. These stimuli can be mechanical, like cuts or pressure, thermal, such as extreme heat or cold, or chemical, like inflammation or toxins. The sensors that detect these signals are called nociceptors, and they are found throughout the body, from the skin to internal organs. When activated, they send electrical impulses through nerve fibers to the spinal cord, and from there, up to the brain. But it is only in the brain that the signal becomes pain. This distinction is crucial. Nociception is the signal. Pain is the perception. We can have nociception without pain, as when the brain is anesthetized, but the body still registers harmful stimuli, and we can feel pain without any detectable injury, as in phantom pain or fibromyalgia. This shows that pain is not simply the result of physical damage, but a neurobiological decision based on context, memory, emotion, and expectation. The brain evaluates the relevance of the signal and determines the degree of suffering to assign to it. This occurs through areas like the thalamus, the somatosensory cortex, the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex. These centers integrate the nociceptive signal with the individual's emotional state, focused attention, past experiences, and even cultural or religious beliefs about what it means to feel pain. Acute pain is essential for survival. It makes us react quickly to threats, withdraw a hand from fire, stop using an injured limb, or seek shelter and treatment. It is a biological alarm that signals something needs to be fixed. But when pain persists long after tissue has healed, it stops being a warning and becomes a disease in itself. This happens in chronic pain, a condition that affects millions of people worldwide and involves changes in the very structure and function of the nervous system. In these cases, brain circuits become sensitized, amplifying small signals, distorting body perception, and creating a constant state of alert. It's as if the brain is stuck in emergency mode, even without a real threat. This amplification of pain can also occur in phenomena like allodynia, when stimuli that don't normally cause pain, such as a light touch or a puff of air, are perceived as painful. There is also hyperalgesia, in which pain is perceived as more intense than expected. These distortions indicate that the nervous system is reacting disproportionately and require treatments beyond painkillers, including psychotherapy, physical therapy, meditation, neuromodulation, and sensory retraining. The same applies to conditions like phantom pain, common in amputees who continue to feel real pain in limbs that no longer exist. In such cases, the brain retains a map of the body that doesn't disappear with the physical absence and continues to activate sensory areas as if the limb was still there. Curiously, pain can also be blocked or ignored in extreme contexts. Wounded soldiers in battle, athletes in grueling competitions, or mothers in labor report moments when pain seems to vanish, a phenomenon attributed to the release of endorphins, the body's natural opioids that act as internal painkillers. The brain can inhibit pain when it interferes with immediate survival. On the other hand, the expectation of pain can intensify its experience even before any actual stimulus. This effect, called nocebo, is the opposite of placebo. When we believe something will hurt, the pain indeed becomes stronger. This shows that the brain doesn't just feel pain, it predicts, imagines, and modulates it before it even arrives. There are also cultural and emotional dimensions to pain. In some spiritual traditions, physical suffering is viewed as purifying or as a bridge to mystical states. In religious rituals or ascetic practices, pain is intentionally sought as a means of transcendence. This reminds us that physical suffering is also a symbolic phenomenon, influenced by values, beliefs, and personal narratives. In medical contexts, understanding pain requires active listening, empathy, and an integrated approach. It's not enough to ask how much does it hurt. One must ask, how does this pain affect your life? After all, two people with the same injury can experience radically different levels of pain, because pain doesn't measure damage, it measures the subjective experience of damage. In a world where medicine increasingly seeks precision and objectivity, pain remains a profoundly human mystery. It is at once a signal and a language, an alarm and a memory, body and mind. And understanding nociception means understanding that physical suffering is ultimately a dialogue between the world that wounds and the brain that interprets. Even with our eyes closed, in complete silence, and our bodies still in a dark room, we still know whether we are standing, lying down, leaning, or spinning. This awareness does not come from vision, touch, or hearing. It comes from an invisible, silent, and incredibly sensitive system located inside the head, more specifically, in the inner ear. This system is called the vestibular system, and its role is to inform the brain of the body's position in space. It detects linear accelerations, rotations, tilts, and subtle posture changes. Without it, we would lose our balance with the slightest movement. Sitting, walking, running, dancing, or even just standing still requires a symphony of unconscious adjustments made possible by this sensory network dedicated exclusively to spatial orientation. The vestibular system is housed within the Park's bony labyrinth, a complex structure inside the temporal bone, right next to the cochlea, which is responsible for hearing. It consists of 3 semicircular canals arranged at perpendicular angles, and 2 chambers called the siu saccule and siu utricle, C. The semicircular canals detect rotational movements of the head, such as turning from side to side or doing somersaults, while the saccule and utricle detect linear movements and static position, such as riding an elevator or tilting the head forward. These components are filled with fluid and lined with hair cells that are sensitive to the movement of this liquid. When the head moves, the fluid shifts and bends the hairs, generating electrical signals sent to the brain. It functions like a microscopic bubble level that responds with millimetric precision to each tilt. These signals are processed by vestibular nuclei in the brainstem, which integrate the information with visual, tactile, and proprioceptive input. From there, the brain coordinates real-time muscular adjustments to maintain balance. Even a small unevenness in the ground is enough to activate this entire chain. Eyes, labyrinth, muscles, and joints all work together to prevent a fall. In more complex situations, like walking on a suspension bridge or spinning on a roller coaster, the vestibular system is intensely activated. That's why we feel dizzy, nauseous, or disoriented when it becomes overloaded or conflicts with other senses. For instance, reading a book in a moving car can cause nausea because the eyes tell the brain we are still, while the inner ear signals movement. This sensory conflict underlies motion sickness, a condition some scientists believe evolved as a protective mechanism against poisons. In the past, ingesting a neurotoxic substance might have caused sensory mismatches, prompting the brain to induce vomiting. Although this theory remains controversial, it reinforces the idea that balance is not just physical, it's also a complex neuroperceptual construct. The vestibular system is also linked to oculomotor reflexes, meaning that eye movements are automatically adjusted in response to head movements. This reflex is so fast and accurate that we can read while walking or moving our heads, a biomechanical feat both silent and essential for navigating the world. Disorders of the vestibular system cause symptoms like vertigo, imbalance, blurred vision, difficulty concentrating, and even panic attacks. Labyrinthitis, for example, is a temporary inflammation of the region that causes intense dizziness and loss of stability. More severe conditions like Meniere's disease involve recurrent episodes of vertigo, tinnitus, and hearing loss and remain difficult to treat. In the elderly, natural weakening of this system is one of the main causes of falls, a public health issue with direct implications for autonomy and quality of life. In astronauts, the absence of gravity completely challenges the vestibular system, causing disorientation and requiring neurosensory adaptation to maintain balance in microgravity. Science has explored ways to train and even replace the vestibular system in cases of injury. Vestibular rehabilitation therapy uses repetitive stimuli and specific movements to retrain the brain to correctly process balance signals. In extreme cases, technologies like vestibular implants are being developed, inspired by cochlear implants used for hearing loss. These advances show that even in such a hidden and automatic sense as balance, there is room for reinvention and recovery. They also highlight how our perception of space and body depends heavily on mechanisms that operate below the level of consciousness. Internal sensors that silently know where the ground is, where the sky is, and where we are. The vestibular system, though rarely remembered, is the invisible anchor that keeps us upright in the world. It allows us to walk without looking at our feet, dance with closed eyes, run in a straight line, or simply stand without falling. And like all senses, it doesn't work alone. It communicates with touch, vision, hearing, and the body's internal sense of position. This ongoing dialogue ensures the harmony of movement, spatial orientation, and bodily control, three silent pillars of conscious life. Close your eyes for a moment and raise your right arm to shoulder height. You know exactly where it is, even without seeing it. You know whether your hand is open or closed, whether your fingers are extended or curled. This silent, precise, and constant awareness of the position, orientation, and movement of our body in space is called proprioception. It is perhaps the most underestimated of the human senses, precisely because it is invisible, automatic, and rarely noticed until it fails. Proprioception allows us to walk in the dark without stumbling, to touch our nose with a finger without missing, to type without looking at the keyboard, to dance with our eyes closed, or to balance on one foot. It is the system that tells us, every second, where we are in relation to ourselves. Unlike vision or hearing, which depend on external stimuli like light or sound, proprioception is an internal sense based on sensors located in the muscles, tendons, and joints. These sensors, known as muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, detect stretches, tensions, and compressions in the tissues. When a muscle contracts or stretches, these receptors send electrical signals through peripheral nerves to the spinal cord and brain. This information is processed in real time, unconsciously, and integrated with the motor, tactile, and vestibular systems. From this integration, the brain continuously adjusts posture, balance, and coordination. This is why we can run, jump, or grab objects precisely even in high-speed or low-visibility situations. The cerebellum dufo, a structure located at the base of the brain, is one of the main centers responsible for processing proprioceptive data. It functions as a fine-tuning hub, comparing intended movement with what is actually happening in the body and instantly correcting any deviations. This makes the body highly responsive. For example, if we trip on a rock, the foot adjusts before we are even aware of the imbalance. When we are about to fall, our arms reflexively move to protect the body. All of this depends on proprioception in action. Moreover, it works in synergy with vision and balance. When one of these systems fails, the others attempt to compensate. That's why standing on one leg with eyes closed makes us more unstable. We lose one of the pillars of sensory coordination. In cases of nerve injury, head trauma, peripheral neuropathy, or degenerative diseases, proprioception can be impaired, and the results are devastating. People with proprioceptive loss describe the feeling of not knowing where their limbs are, as if they are disconnected from their own body. One of the most well-known cases is Ian Waterman, a British man who completely lost his proprioception after a viral infection. Without this sense, he had to relearn how to move by constantly watching his body. Walking, eating, or writing required continuous visual attention, because without proprioception, the body becomes an enigma. This condition reveals how much we rely on a sense that operates silently, but is absolutely essential for any fluid, balanced, and coordinated movement. Proprioception can also be trained. Dancers, athletes, acrobats, and martial artists develop high levels of bodily awareness, the result of years of repetition and refinement of the proprioceptive system. Exercises like Pilates, yoga, and Tai Chi are effective in enhancing this awareness, improving posture, preventing falls, and refining motor control. Growing children need to explore space with their bodies to consolidate proprioception. Playing, climbing, running, and jumping all help build the internal body map used throughout life. Likewise, elderly individuals who spend too much time seated or with reduced mobility tend to gradually lose this capacity, increasing their risk of falls. That's why proprioceptive rehabilitation programs are essential in physical therapy, neurology, and geriatrics. In medicine, simple proprioceptive tests, like asking a patient to touch their nose with eyes closed or to balance while blindfolded, help identify early neurological deficits. In contemporary neuroscience, research on virtual reality and brain-machine interfaces is exploring how proprioception can be artificially recreated. A robotic arm, for instance, only becomes functional for an amputee when they can feel, even artificially, where that arm is and what it is doing. This challenge is immense, as it requires not just motor control, but also sensory feedback. Reconstructing proprioception is the next step towards seamless integration between humans and machines. In philosophy and psychology, proprioception is considered one of the foundations of bodily self-awareness. It sustains the sense that we inhabit a body, that we have a physical self situated in space. Without it, we lose the sense of unity, of presence, of the boundary between self and world. That is why proprioception is more than just a technical sense. It is the silent perception of the body as personal territory. It is the invisible foundation of balance, action, and identity. The human brain is not a rigid machine with fixed functions, but a dynamic and adaptable system. When one sense fails, whether due to illness, trauma, or genetics, the other senses reorganize to compensate for the loss. This phenomenon is called sensory neuroplasticity, and it completely redefines what it means to see, hear, touch, or feel. People who are blind from birth, for example, develop a sophisticated spatial perception using only hearing and touch. Many are capable of practicing what's known as human echolocation. producing tongue clicks and interpreting the echoes of those sounds to identify walls, doors, objects, and even the size of rooms. Their brains repurpose the visual cortex, originally meant for sight, to process sounds and tactile inputs with much greater precision. It's as if the brain says, if the eyes don't work, I'll use this area to hear better. Neuroimaging studies show that in blind individuals, the visual areas of the brain activate intensely when they read braille, touch objects, or hear spatial sounds. This functional reallocation is possible because the brain has a high degree of plasticity, especially during childhood, but also throughout life. The reverse is also true. Deaf individuals develop heightened visual and tactile perception. They detect microfacial expressions with greater accuracy, sense subtle vibrations through their bodies, and in some cases, feel music through rhythmic beats and vibrating surfaces. Deaf parties, for example, use powerful speakers directed at the floor so that people can dance by feeling the music's pulse with their feet. The absence of hearing doesn't prevent the body from experiencing sound. It simply translates it through other sensory pathways. This sensory adaptability is not just a biological curiosity. It is the key to innovative assistive technologies. Researchers have created devices that translate visual images into sound patterns, known as sensory substitution systems, so that blind individuals can see through sound. One example is the voice, which transforms scenes captured by a camera into soundscapes that can be interpreted with training. Over time, users learn to distinguish shapes, edges, movements, and even facial expressions just by hearing. Most impressively, the brain processes these auditory inputs as visual, activating regions of the occipital cortex. This shows that the brain cares less about the type of stimulus and more about the pattern and usefulness of the information. Another example is found in the rehabilitation of patients with amputated limbs. Many suffer from phantom limb pain, a painful sensation in a limb that no longer exists. Techniques like mirror therapy, virtual reality, and tactile stimulation have been used to reconfigure the brain's body map, reducing or even eliminating this pain. Similarly, people with paralysis or spinal cord injuries are using brain-machine interfaces to control robotic arms, computers, or even exoskeletons. But control only becomes natural when there is more sensory feedback, when the brain can feel what it's controlling. That's why researchers are implanting sensors in prosthetics that send signals to the nervous system, partially restoring the sensation of touch and movement. Sensory neuroplasticity also has emotional and cognitive implications. People who lose one sense often develop complex mental strategies to interact with the world. They build internal maps, spatial memories, body rhythms, and multisensory associations that allow them to function independently. This changes how they learn, remember, and express themselves. There are blind writers, deaf musicians, dancers with motor disabilities, all living examples of how the human brain reprograms its roots when necessary, and how the body finds new paths to exist. This plasticity challenges traditional limits of perception and forces us to rethink what sensory normality truly means. Moreover, neuroplasticity can be induced in anyone, even without disabilities. When we learn to play a musical instrument, for example, we create new connections between hearing, touch, coordination, and emotion. When we practice yoga, we enhance bodily awareness and proprioceptive sensitivity. When we dance, we train balance, rhythm, and tactile interaction with space and others. The brain responds to varied stimuli with constant reorganization. That's why the more sensory experiences we have, the richer and more resilient our perception of the world becomes. And when one sense fails, the others don't just compensate, they might expand their functions. In the end, the cases of blind individuals who see with sound or deaf individuals who feel music teach us that the brain is a master of adaptation. It isn't limited to fixed maps or singular trajectories. It reinvents itself in the face of challenge. It transforms limitations into possibilities, and in doing so it reveals the profound and silent power of neuroplasticity, the ability to sense the world in ways far beyond what we believed possible. Imagine seeing colors when hearing music, tasting flavors upon hearing names, or associating numbers with personalities. For many people, this isn't imagination. It's a real and constant experience. This phenomenon is called synesthesia. a neurological crossover of the senses in which activating one sensory modality automatically evokes another. Unlike poetic metaphors, like saying a voice is sweet or a color is warm, synesthesia is a measurable neurological phenomenon with genetic roots present in about 3% of the population. And while it may seem exotic, it offers an extraordinary window into how the brain organizes, interprets, and creatively connects the senses in a deeply personal way. Dozens of forms of synesthesia have been documented. The most common include grapheme color synesthesia, where letters and numbers evoke specific colors; auditory visual synesthesia, where sounds trigger real-time shapes and colors; lexical gustatory synesthesia, where specific words cause taste sensations; and spatial sequence synesthesia, where dates and days of the week are perceived as physical locations around the body. Synesthetic people don't imagine these connections, they experience them. For someone with grapheme color synesthesia, for example, the letter A will always be red. The number 4 will always be blue, regardless of context. These links are automatic, stable throughout life, and often useful, aiding memory and creativity. Science suggests that synesthesia results from Murrow's increased or less inhibited neural connections between sensory areas in the brain. In non-synesthetic individuals, these areas function in a more segregated manner, but in synesthetes there's a higher degree of leakage or cooperation between circuits. For instance, hearing a musical note may activate not just the auditory cortex, but also visual areas, generating perceptions of shapes, textures, or colors. This cross-communication is not considered a disorder, but rather a neurological variation, usually accompanied by normal or even enhanced cognitive function. Many synesthetes are creative, talented in art, music, or languages, as their minds access the world through multiple channels simultaneously. Synesthesia also raises questions about the origin of sensory perception in early life. Research suggests that all human babies are born with a certain degree of synesthesia, which becomes refined and inhibited over development. In the first months of life, the senses are not yet fully separated. Light may provoke agitation, a sound may cause a visual reflex. Over time, the brain learns to distinguish and specialize sensory channels. But in some people, this separation remains incomplete, resulting in persistent synesthesia. This implies that the human mind is naturally multisensory, and that the division between sight, hearing, touch, and other senses is a developed construction, not an absolute given. In clinical and experimental contexts, synesthesia is used as a tool to study brain plasticity, consciousness, and sensory integration mechanisms. Researchers use brain imaging to observe the simultaneous activation of distinct areas during synesthetic experiences, revealing how the brain maps the world in multiple layers. There's also growing interest in inducing synesthetic states through deep meditation, psychedelics, or sensory training, aiming to expand perceptual experience even in non-synesthetic brains. In certain neurological or psychiatric conditions, such as migraine with aura or some forms of autism spectrum disorder, spontaneous synesthetic experiences have also been reported, suggesting a continuum between typical and cross-modal perception. Culturally, synesthesia has inspired artists like Kandinsky, who linked colors to sounds, and composers like Olivier Messiaen, who saw chords as chromatic combinations. Synesthetic poets describe smells through visual metaphors and textures as melodies. These expressions are not just poetic license, they're authentic translations of inner experience. In education, researchers explore how synesthesia can aid language learning, abstract memory retention, and the development of new teaching methods, especially for children with atypical cognitive profiles. In the end, synesthesia forces us to rethink the boundaries between the senses. It shows that seeing, hearing, smelling, or touching are not isolated actions, but aspects of an integrated, subjective perception. It reveals that the brain is capable of blending information into unexpected compositions, that a sound can have color, a word can have taste, a Tuesday can be lilac. And perhaps, more than a neurological curiosity, synesthesia is a reminder that reality, as we perceive it, is a continuous creation of the mind, and that the world can quite literally be felt in many ways at once. Humans see only a narrow band of light, hear within a limited range of frequencies, and interpret the world through highly specialized but restricted senses. Beyond this sensory spectrum lies a parallel universe of perception, accessible only to other animals. Senses we lack or barely understand reveal alternative ways of existing in the world. Animals navigate, hunt, migrate, and communicate using mechanisms such as echolocation, magnetoreception, ultraviolet vision, infrared detection, electroreception, and even ultra-sensitive chemical sensors. What we call reality is therefore just a slice of what nature offers as perceptual possibilities. Understanding these animal senses is like opening windows into other modes of existence. Let's begin with echolocation, one of the most impressive examples of active perception. Bats, dolphins, and some nocturnal birds emit sounds that bounce off their surroundings and return as echoes. By interpreting these echoes, these animals construct a three-dimensional map of the space around them, identifying obstacles, prey, and even tiny surface textures. In dolphins, echolocation is so precise that they can distinguish between objects of the same size but different densities, even in murky waters. For their brains, sound becomes a form of sight, and in some cases, even more effective than light. Echolocation has inspired human technologies such as sonar and radar, but it still remains far beyond our direct biological capabilities. Another remarkable sense is magnetoreception, the ability to perceive Earth's magnetic field. This ability is found in sea turtles, pigeons, whales, salmon, and many migratory bird species. These animals use the magnetic field as a biological GPS, navigating thousands of kilometers with astonishing accuracy, even without visual cues. While the exact mechanism remains debated, evidence suggests that proteins called cryptochromes, found in the eyes of some animals, may respond to the inclination and intensity of the magnetic field. Other studies suggest that particles of magnetite, a magnetic mineral found in nervous tissue, function as natural directional sensors. Regardless of the pathway, the conclusion is clear. Some creatures literally feel north, as if the compass were inside them. Ultraviolet vision is another sensory resource beyond human reach. Bees, butterflies, reindeer, birds, and even some fish can see wavelengths below 400 nanometers, the ultraviolet spectrum. This ability allows them to perceive patterns on flowers invisible to us, find chemical trails, spot camouflaged predators, or detect subtle changes in snow. Reindeer, for instance, can see frozen urine and lichens reflecting UV light, essential clues for locating food and spotting wolves in Arctic regions. Birds use UV to assess the health and fertility of potential mates, as healthy feathers reflect more UV light. The world seen by these animals is filled with glows and contrasts that simply do not exist for us. Then there are thermal predators, such as pythons and rattlesnakes, which have infrared sensors around their mouths. These specialized organs detect the heat emitted by warm-blooded prey, even in total darkness. It's as if they had a natural thermal vision based on infrared radiation, a type of light that the human body also emits, but we do not consciously perceive. Some species of beetles also use infrared to detect fires from kilometers away, finding freshly burned logs ideal for laying eggs. These examples show that visible light is only a small window within a vast electromagnetic spectrum, and that other animals see entire worlds hidden in what, for us, is invisible. Electroreception is another sensory gem of the animal kingdom. Sharks, rays, and electric fish can detect electric fields generated by the muscles and nerves of other organisms. This allows them to hunt in the dark, locate prey buried in sand, and even navigate by subtle differences in the marine electric field. Some species generate their own electric fields and detect distortions in them to see their environment, a kind of electrical radar. These animals have structures called ampullae of Lorenzini, which function as ultra-precise electric sensors. In freshwater, the African elephant fish uses electroreception for communication, individual recognition, and spatial orientation. Other subtler senses include pressure detection through lateral lines in fish, which help them sense water currents, and extreme chemoreception, as seen in dogs that can detect odors in parts per trillion. Ants use pheromones to create invisible olfactory maps in the environment, Sharks can detect a single drop of blood from miles away. Some insects sense trace amounts of carbon dioxide. There are even reports of birds sensitive to atmospheric electric fields, helping them anticipate storms. These extra-human senses challenge our notion of reality. They show that the world is broader than what we perceive, and that animals live in parallel sensory realities, each shaped by specific evolutionary adaptations. For an owl, the world is sound. For a bee, it's polarized light. For a rattlesnake, it's heat. For an electric fish, it's field. For us, all of that is invisible unless we expand our senses with scientific tools. In the end, understanding these senses is not just a zoological curiosity, it's a lesson in humility. It reminds us that perception is a construct, and that what we call the real world is merely the version available to our species. By studying animal senses, we expand not only our knowledge but also our imagination. What if we could see ultraviolet, feel magnetism, track emotion by scent? Perhaps by understanding other creatures' sensory windows, we'll discover new ways to feel the world beyond the human. The senses are the brain's windows to the world. But what happens when those windows distort, close, or begin to reflect images that don't exist? Although our senses are generally reliable, the brain can be deceived by the very structures that grant it access to reality. This sensory betrayal is not an exception. It's a constant possibility. Under certain conditions, our eyes see what isn't there, our ears hear voices that don't exist, and our skin feels touches that never happened. These experiences, known as the sensory hallucinations, are like cracks in the brain's perceptual fabric, and contrary to popular belief, they are not exclusive to psychiatric disorders. They can emerge during high fevers, sleep deprivation, drug use, brain trauma, neurological diseases, or even moments of grief and loneliness. Hallucinations are vivid, involuntary perceptions in the absence of external stimuli. They can be visual, so seeing shadows, lights, shapes; auditory, hearing voices, noises, music; tactile, feeling something crawling on the skin or a sudden touch; olfactory, smelling smoke, perfumes, or imaginary chemicals; and even gustatory, tasting non-existent poisons or metallic flavors. In neurological conditions like temporal lobe epilepsy, patients often report intense smells before seizures, a sensory warning known as an aura. In illnesses such as Parkinson's disease or dementia with Lewy bodies, visual hallucinations are common, often recurring, and may involve people, animals, or complex scenes. In psychopathology, hallucinations fall under the category of sensory delusions, often associated with disorders like schizophrenia. In these cases, the mind not only perceives what isn't real, but also believes firmly in the truth of the experience. The brain constructs narratives to justify corrupted senses. A voice is not just a sound, but it's an entity, a message, a threat. A vision is not just a shadow, it's a presence. These delusions involve brain areas responsible not only for perception, but also for meaning-making, such as the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. They show that the senses do not operate in isolation. They are part of a mental ecosystem that includes emotion, belief, memory, and identity. Hypnagogic hallucinations, which occur at the threshold between wakefulness and sleep, are more common than people think. Many have experienced them unknowingly, hearing someone call your name, feeling a presence in the room, or seeing figures beside the bed. These events don't indicate pathology. They are byproducts of the brain transitioning between states of consciousness. On the other hand, extreme sensory deprivation, such as isolation in total darkness or silence, can trigger hallucinations within hours. Deprived of input, the brain starts generating its own images and sounds, as if trying to find meaning in the void. This demonstrates that perception is not only reactive, it is active and constructive. When there is no data, the brain invents it. Psychedelic substances like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT induce intense, multifaceted hallucinations. Colors that move, sounds that bend, textures that breathe, lights that speak. These altered states of consciousness are used in therapeutic, spiritual, and creative contexts, but they also reveal much about the flexibility of the human brain. Hallucinations induced by these substances are not mere distortions, They reflect sensory networks communicating in unconventional ways. Neuroscientists have observed that under psychedelics, areas of the brain that are normally isolated begin to connect, creating synesthetic experiences and highly subjective visions. The brain, freed from its usual filters, reveals that perceived reality is only one among many possibilities. There are also cognitive illusions that resemble hallucinations, mistaking faces in crowds, hearing your phone vibrate when it's off, smelling food that isn't there, sensing someone's presence in an empty room. These false perceptions are prediction errors, the brain anticipating stimuli based on memory and context. After all, perception is as much inference as it is reception. Our sensory system makes assumptions constantly. When it's right, we call it intuition. When it's wrong, we call it illusion. And when it persists in error, we call it delusion. Science also acknowledges the existence of out-of-body experiences, such as floating outside oneself, seeing one's body from the outside, or feeling split in two. These events occur during trauma, deep meditation, near-death experiences, or electrical stimulation of specific brain areas like the temporoparietal junction. Though described for millennia in spiritual traditions, they are now studied in neuroscience as disorders of sensory and proprioceptive integration. They reinforce the idea that the self is a neural construction maintained by multiple senses operating in harmony. When that harmony fails, reality fragments. In the end, senses are not absolute truths. They are neural translations of a vast world, filtered through flesh, time, and memory. And when those translations fail, what remains is the raw perception of what the brain is capable of inventing. Reality then ceases to be an external certainty and becomes an internal landscape where seeing, hearing, touching, or smelling can be as true as it is illusory. All the senses, vision, hearing, touch, smell, taste, balance, proprioception, and nociception, are merely entryways. The true spectacle begins after those signals pass through these doors and arrive at the central stage, the cosent sensory brain. It is here that raw data becomes conscious perception. Seeing a flower, hearing music, tasting food, or feeling the texture of a fabric is only possible because the brain integrates, interprets, and reconstructs. Those experiences based on millions of electrical impulses received each second. Each sense has its own neural route, but all these routes converge, communicate, and mutually adjust. The sensory brain is therefore a command center of reality, where scattered pieces come together to form what we call the world. This integration begins in specific regions. Vision is processed in the occipital cortex, hearing in the temporal lobe, touch and proprioception in the somatosensory cortex, located in the parietal lobe. Smell, due to its ancestral connection to the limbic system, has more direct pathways to emotion and memory. Despite this apparent division, the brain doesn't treat the senses as isolated departments. There are interconnected neural networks that ensure sounds and images align, flavors match aromas, and touches make sense with what we see. That's why we can watch a movie, enjoy a dish, or dance to music with a single, fluid, coherent perception. This capacity for sensory fusion is so essential that when it fails, the world feels fragmented, incoherent, even frightening. At the core of this integration lies the multimodal associative cortex, especially areas like the posterior parietal lobe, the temporoparietal junction, and the prefrontal cortex. These regions cross visual data with auditory signals, tactile sensations with proprioceptive input, and current perception with memory. It's where the sense of self in space is born, where body orientation, sound direction, and object recognition take place. Without these regions, the senses would not be able to communicate. People with lesions in these areas may develop conditions such as agnosia, where an object is seen but not recognized, or pain asymbolia, where pain is physically felt but lacks emotional suffering. These cases show that to feel is not enough. One must make sense of what is felt. The brain is also highly predictive. It does not passively await stimuli. It anticipates, compares, and corrects. Every new perception is interpreted in light of what we already know. If we see something incomplete, the brain fills it in. If we hear distorted speech, it adjusts based on context. This predictive modeling of perception saves energy, speeds up reactions, and avoids cognitive overload. However, this efficiency comes at a cost. We are always vulnerable to cognitive illusions, incorrect assumptions, and distorted memories. Seeing is not just about using the eyes, it is about interpreting with the brain. And that brain is fallible, shaped by emotion, experience, and expectation. Beyond horizontal integration between senses, there is also vertical integration between sensation and emotion. What we feel in the body connects with what we feel in the mind. A scent can trigger nostalgia. A sound can evoke fear. A touch can bring comfort or disgust. These connections are mediated by structures like the limbic system, involving the amygdala, linked to fear and alertness, the hippocampus, responsible for memory, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which regulates emotional pain. That's why the senses not only inform us about the world, they also deeply affect us. The sensory brain is an emotional brain. This architecture also explains why sensory experiences can be a therapeutic. Techniques like aromatherapy, music therapy, tactile stimulation, vestibular stimulation, and multisensory exposure are used to treat trauma, developmental disorders, neurological conditions, and emotional imbalances. Children with autism, for instance, benefit from organized sensory environments. Alzheimer's patients respond better to familiar stimuli. People with depression improve with natural light, gentle touch, and the sound of nature. The sensory brain is, therefore, a privileged target for care and healing. Modern neuroscience is intensely studying sensory consciousness, the process through which raw stimuli become subjective experience. How does the brain turn vibrations into music? How does it convert molecules into scent? How does it create the illusion of a coherent image from millions of light points? While full answers are still distant, we know this depends on neural circuits organized in highly complex and dynamic patterns. According to many theories, consciousness emerges from the synchrony of multiple sensory regions. When everything aligns, we feel that we are here, now, in the world. At its core, the sensory brain is the center of conscious feeling. It does not merely record the world, it reinvents it. It paints, sounds, perfumes, and transforms the world into something personal, intimate, and alive. And each brain does it in its own way. Every color, sound, texture, or aroma we experience is a reflection of who we are, what we've lived, and what we expect. To feel, therefore, is not a neutral act. It is an act of creation. And the brain, with all its maps, connections, and mysteries, is the invisible artist behind everything we call reality. Sensing has always been an organic, silent, and spontaneous act. But today we are on the verge of a sensory revolution that could forever change the way humans perceive the world. With advances in neuroscience, biotechnology, and sensory engineering, we are not just understanding how the senses work. We are learning to recreate them, amplify them, and even invent new ones. The human body, once limited by biology, is now a field of technological experimentation. We are building artificial eyes, bionic ears, electronic skin, and digital noses. We are teaching the brain to see without eyes, to touch without skin, to hear through bones. And more than that, we are creating forms of perception that have never existed in human nature. One of the most promising fields is that of sensory neural implants. Cochlear implants already restore partial hearing to people with profound deafness by directly stimulating the auditory nerve. For blindness caused by retinal degeneration, artificial retinas are being developed to capture light and transmit it to the brain via microelectrodes. Patients with prosthetic hands can now receive tactile feedback thanks to sensors connected to nerves, allowing them to feel pressure, texture, and temperature in real time. These brain-machine interfaces are more than prosthetics. They are sensory extensions of the mind, proving that feeling can be reprogrammed, rebuilt, and expanded with circuits and code. Another revolutionary breakthrough is the use of augmented and virtual reality with sensory feedback. Digital environments can now include not just sound and image, but also smell, vibration, resistance, and temperature. Companies are developing tactile gloves that simulate touch, headphones that project three-dimensional sound with millimeter precision, and garments that vibrate in response to visual stimuli. In rehabilitation therapies, gaming, and training, these systems offer sensory experiences almost indistinguishable from reality. And the impact goes beyond entertainment. Soldiers, surgeons, and pilots are being trained in virtual environments with tactile feedback, preparing both body and brain for real-world situations with greater safety and precision. But perhaps the most radical field is that of the creating new senses, known as a sensory neuroaugmentation. Some experimental cases are already underway. People implant magnetic sensors under the skin to feel electromagnetic fields, or vibratory chips in their bodies to detect cardinal direction. There are projects where volunteers receive coded tactile stimuli to perceive data such as air pollution levels or Earth's seismic activity. These devices turn abstract information into continuous sensory experience, creating a kind of sixth, seventh, or eighth sense. The brain, surprisingly, learns to integrate these new inputs, reorganizing its sensory map to incorporate completely novel sources of information. This flexibility is made possible by neuroplasticity, which remains the foundation of it all. The brain accepts stimuli if they are consistent, repetitive, and useful. This opens the door to developing senses for navigating the internet through vibration, perceiving invisible radiation, identifying human emotions through thermal changes, or even experiencing the perception of other species, like seeing in infrared or hearing ultrasonic frequencies. The boundary between nature and technology is becoming fluid, and this raises deep philosophical questions. What does it mean to feel? Where does the body end? What does it mean to experience reality? We are creating not just new tools, but new modes of existence. In healthcare, these technologies hold transformative potential. People with spinal cord injuries may regain sensation. Patients with chronic pain may use neurostimulation to turn off the pain circuit. Children with sensory disorders may benefit from carefully calibrated virtual environments to develop tolerance and adaptation. There is advanced research on direct brain intercoms, which could allow sensory stimuli to be transmitted from one brain to another, not as words but as pure sensations. In the not-so-distant future, it may be possible to unshare what one feels directly, like a universal language of experience. Ethics, however, must keep pace with science. Manipulating perception opens the door to emotional control, sensory addiction, and distorted realities. Sensory privacy, currently non-existent as a legal concept, will be one of the major challenges of the neuroengineering age. How do we protect the integrity of our senses? How do we avoid dependence on artificial stimuli? How do we distinguish what is natural from what is induced? These questions need to be addressed with the same urgency as the technologies themselves evolve. In the end, the science of sensing is no longer just a way to explain our inner world. It is becoming a true tool for expanding consciousness. The body, once shaped by biological limits, is now being redesigned by the possibilities of the mind. And the brain, this plastic and curious organ, continues to learn, integrate, and translate any signal that makes sense. We are slowly moving from merely interpreting reality to building it with our own senses.